Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats. I guess we don't have any candy wrappers to welcome. Welcome to today's program, How Canada-U.S. Hydroelectric Partnerships Reinforce America's Clean Energy Economy. And greetings to those of you watching via the webcast or the film version in the future. I'm David Biette. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and U.S.-Canada relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. We focus our work in three areas: borders and border security, trade, and the topic of today's program, energy and environment. First, though, I would like to thank our partners in this event, the Canadian government, the province of Manitoba, and the province of Quebec, all through their local Washington offices, which are staffed by really great people who are wonderful to work with. And a little background for those of you who are new to the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress as the official memorial to the 28th president, our only president with a PhD. At the center, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy by fostering independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas as we tackle the nation's problems and challenges. Canada has long been a top supplier of energy to the United States, and there's a decades-long history of Canadian hydropower providing reliable baseload power to the U.S. electric grid. The President, in his State of the Union address earlier this month, mentioned the need for more clean energy and has mentioned that the United States needs to look at, quote, all of the above options. Our states and local utilities have worked with Canadian provinces to develop this hydropower. The energy actually flows both ways. Our panelists today will give us insight into how we are developing our clean economy, what role hydropower partnerships can play, and how this makes sense for business, for government, and for the American people. A little bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being webcast, so please, when we come to the Q&A part, wait for a microphone before speaking and identify yourself and your affiliation. Exit doors are out to the left or out to the right. Follow the exit signs. Today's program will begin with remarks from Canada's ambassador to the United States, Gary Doer. His successor as Premier of Manitoba, Greg Selinger, will follow. It's great to have two such important representatives of Manitoba with us today, and I notice in the audience several people who are from Manitoba as well, so welcome. You can find more biographical information in the handout, and that's also available at our website for those of you watching the webcast. Premier Selinger and Ambassador Doer have agreed to take questions following their presentations. And a little bit of advertising. The Canada Institute's next program will look at energy infrastructure. It'll take place next Thursday, March 7th, from 9 a.m. to noon. Ambassador Doer.
Thank you very much, David, and it's great to be here with the Premier and all our friends that are here this afternoon. The Woodrow Wilson International Institute is a great forum for all of us to participate in and with. I think we just had a recent meeting on the Arctic, and I was asked some very tough questions: who should be part of the Arctic Council and who shouldn't be. I don't know whether I gave the right diplomatic answer, but I said if you have polar bears, you're in, and if you don't, if you have panda bears, maybe you're not in. But I don't think that was the correct answer. So if you're webcasting, please delete that. I don't want to get any trouble. You mentioned that Woodrow Wilson was the only president to have a PhD. One of the two premiers from Manitoba that's here presently has a PhD, and I'm not the one that has one. So he may be the only premier from Manitoba. I try to think, going through the list, the 22 of them. Pretty close, might be pretty close. If it isn't close, I'll make it up anyway. He's the only premier that I believe has a PhD. It's wonderful to be here at this time, and the discussion is on sequestration. Sequestration. In Canada, we have a whole different meaning for sequestration. That's where we take CO2, put it in the ground, and have more energy efficiency for oil. Sequestration being an automatic budget reduction is something we don't understand, so we have to do a lot of simultaneous translation of budgetary action in Canada and in provinces to the American context. Certainly, it's wonderful to be here at a time also that it's just less than 24 hours after a very important outreach event for Canada. The movie Argo won the Best Academy Award movie presentation. We're pleased about that. We had nothing to do with it, but we're really happy it happened. And we, of course, I think believe that movie, to some small degree, demonstrates the partnership between Canada and the United States. Certainly, in terms of Canada-U.S. relations, we've had a long relationship with the United States on cleaner air, cleaner water, and partnership on energy. We participated just a few decades ago with you in Montreal and Montreal on the Montreal Protocol when only 16 countries came together to eliminate or reduce and eliminate ozone-depleting materials in the world. And we started with 16 countries. We're now to 165 countries. And it's actually reduced GHGs more than the Kyoto Protocol in the world, the Montreal Protocol. And it was very important, we believe, to have a partnership with the United States to make that a go in terms of the challenges we had. We worked together on clean water projects, including the Great Lakes. 20% of the fresh water in the world is the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. There's other projects we're working on together, the Lake of the Woods, the Columbia River, the Flathead River, Devil's Lake, the Missouri River, the Beaufort Sea, the Lake Champlain, the areas east of us in the Atlantic Ocean. So we work continuously on cleaner water policies between our two countries. In that context, I was pleased that at Copenhagen, which Premier Salinger attended, and I attended as an ambassador with our Prime Minister, that the provinces and the federal government were there speaking about the opportunities of clean energy, the challenges for climate change in Copenhagen. And I was pleased that President Obama was very forceful in that meeting. He didn't get a lot of credit, I think, in the United States, but coming out with an international agreement called Copenhagen, we think is very, very important. And for us in Canada, where we had the startup of signing on to Kyoto, and then the fact that then it was rejected later on in the U.S., at least we now had an agreement between Canada and the United States would be comparable and doable in terms of a 17% reductions by the year 2020 over 1995. Since that announcement, we in Canada have announced a number of measures that will help us implement our obligations. One is we took all the light vehicle emission standards. Some of us had joined in on the California tailpipe emission standards. We took the provincial and state standards and tried to not only roll it into one standard, but improve it, because we also included air conditioning as part of the vehicle emission standard regulations that came out. And we implemented that in such a way that will have dramatic, and the most dramatic and radical reductions of GHGs in our two countries by those light vehicle emission standards. A lot of people don't know. They see a smokestack when they hear about climate change, but really it's the cars we drive that were the largest emitters in both Canada and United States. We since announced heavy trucks. In fact, we announced a second tranche of heavy trucks today in Ottawa, again aligning them with the United States. And for our case, we've also announced with the State Department the black carbon regulations that did flow from some of the on-ramps that the Montreal Protocol provided in terms of black carbon that represents a real threat to ice in the Arctic for our region. Having said that, we still have a lot of work to do in Canada and in the United States. We have proceeded to move on coal in Canada to require that any refurbishment of a coal plant in our country has to be at or below natural gas emission levels. It took a lot of time. It wasn't always love, trust, and pixie dust between the federal government and the provincial government to get that regulation in place. And when I'm here in Washington, I get a lot of questions from environmental officials. What did you do? How did you do it? When is it going to take, what is it going to mean? And what is it going to mean for GHGs? Obviously, coal in Canada, I think, represents about 13% of our electrical generation. I believe in the United States, it's up to 40% of electrical generation is coal. So one of my frustrations coming here as ambassador is hydroelectric power. Why is it not defined as renewable? When I got here in the Waxman-Markey bill and in some of the bills that then Senator Kerry was proposing and I think it was 5 separate bills in the Senate, nobody would consider hydro as renewable. You would have wind, solar, black licorice, they call it. There was an article in the Washington Post this weekend, that would actually were, in our view, a subsidy to the paper industry in the United States, as opposed to a renewable, in our view, our unbiased view from Canada. And so you get black licorice is renewable, and hydroelectric power is not considered or defined as renewable. In our view is if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. It's renewable. It's water that goes through the. Come on in. I don't want to hold you up here. Please come on in. It is renewable. Now, we tried in many different places, and I know that it was raised by the governors, Governor Douglas, who had signed a major agreement with Hydro-Quebec. It was raised by the Governors Association with the president at the White House when they were doing when they were dealing with the energy bills. There were so many of them at that time. It was before my time, but I know that they did raise it. And I know also that the Prime Minister raised it with the president at our North American Leaders Summit meeting, raised the issue of both transmission and the issue of hydro being considered as renewable. We've had some success of hydro being defined as renewable by utilities and by states, province to state. Hydro-Quebec with Vermont, Manitoba Hydro, I think, is part of the renewable energy portfolio in the province or state of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm wrong, Greg's looking, I'm wrong. Okay, I take that back. But there was some consideration of it. I know that governors in the past in Minnesota had declared it as renewable. We have raised it we have raised that with California in terms of British Columbia, its export sales into that state. And so far, we haven't been able to get the kind of definition that the provinces have used that hydro is renewable. At the Council of Federation meeting, which is a meeting of the premiers of the provinces and territories, we defined hydroelectric power, wind and solar, and geothermal as renewable energy sources. And so for the Woodrow Wilson Institute, I think one of the challenges for us here on an international basis is to look at this as a renewable energy. In Canada, it actually allows us to have 60% renewable in a portfolio of electricity that is 70% non-emitting. Part of that is nuclear, 3% is wind and solar, and 60% is hydro. And we find that hydro is, in essence, a battery for more wind or more solar. This thing that you subtract one from the other is not the case. If sometimes if you don't have as much water, you may have more wind, or if you don't have enough wind, you've got water and hydro. It is not some people treat it as a subtraction, I think here in Washington, as opposed to an addition or an opportunity. That would be my view of it. We have about 1 million homes primarily serviced by hydroelectric power from Canada. And we have challenges every time there's a transmission line in our own country and in your country. I've joked before that there's one lawyer per megawatt for any transmission line approved, but I can't use that joke anymore because I'm a diplomat, not a premier anymore, and I can't use that. But certainly, I think it's wonderful we're having this opportunity to discuss hydro, but I think we discuss it as an opportunity with other renewables, as an opportunity with the development of other less emitting resources like gas that's going to take place in the United States, with the development of gas in this country. And hydro is, again, non-emitting, as opposed to gas is 50% less than coal. Hydropower, in our definition, is non-emitting, and therefore, on the GHG front, part of a solution for both our countries to reduce GHGs, consistent with the international agreements that we've agreed to and signed on to. So that is my view of it, and very interesting times on energy, I'm sure, as the Premier has found on the Hill. It's now my privilege to introduce the Premier of the great province of Manitoba, Premier Greg Salinger, who was elected Premier in an election just recently, and was Premier in 2009, became Premier in 2009 after 10 years of being the Finance Minister. He's at Finance Minister, he often used to say to me he was the goalie to stop all these spending proposals. Now he's the Premier. Now he has to fight with his own Finance Minister to get some of these things done. But it's great to see him here. He, along with being the Finance Minister for 10 years in Manitoba, was the Minister responsible for Manitoba Hydro. We introduced major initiatives, not only in closing down coal under his leadership and stewardship, but also increasing energy efficiency for buildings, both home-owned houses and industrial buildings. And I'm really pleased to say that he has a PhD from the London School of Economics, a master's degree from Queen's, a bachelor's degree from the University of Manitoba, a great leader on clean energy, and a great leader on reducing greenhouse gases in our North American neighborhood, Premier Greg Salinger. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I want to thank Ambassador Dewar for the supper that he provided last night. He told us that he cooked the entire supper himself. And I thought the vegetables were extremely good, Gary. Very well sliced and diced. And the salmon was particularly good, but it's great to have a Manitoban down here as ambassador to the United States. I mean, there's just so many people that feel welcome with Ambassador Dewar when they come here, and many of them do, and it's just a great relationship to have a former Premier being an ambassador. He knows many of the governors from around the United States. He's networked with those governors over many years as a Premier, and as you know, so much of what needs to change needs the support of the states and the leadership of the states, and so when you have an ambassador that can work with governors as well as people on the Hill, it makes a gigantic difference, and we've seen a big difference. And I have to tell you, when I came down here 2 years ago, we came down on some water issues, but we also came down on energy issues, and I've seen a dramatic change in the last 2 years, some dramatic improvements, and just the recognition of Canadian hydro as being part of the solution to a clean energy strategy in the United States. This morning I met with Senator Heidekamp from North Dakota. We met with the staffs of Senators Hoven and Murkowski, and we met with the incoming chair of the Energy Committee, Senator Wyden, and had a good conversation with him. And yesterday we met the National Hydropower Association, and I've met with Governors Quinn from Illinois and Governor Dalrymple from North Dakota, and the Governor of Iowa, Governor Herbert, who has invited us as the chair of the Western Governors Association to contribute a chapter to his document that he's doing on energy strategy. So we seem at all levels to be seized with where we're going on energy strategy, and we're very pleased to be part of that. And we always have been part of that. I do want to mention also we have Andre Boisclair here, who's the Delegate General from Quebec in New York, but he was a former Minister of the Environment as well, and is very seized of these issues. And we've been together at a couple of events already and had some good discussion. And Quebec and Manitoba have always had very similar views when it comes to hydro. They're both major resources for us, and we're major exporters for decades into the United States. And so these partnerships are extremely important for us. The fundamental case I want to make is that Canadian hydro should be perceived as an essential component to a clean energy strategy for North America, and of course for the United States as the key largest and most dominant economy within the North American context. And Is it going to solve all of your problems? No, but it does make a gigantic difference. We've got, you're going to have people on your panel later on, like David McMillan, and he'll explain to you why it's an essential component of his relationship with Manitoba Hydro and Minnesota Power. But we think it's just a huge part of what the solution is, and it's a huge part of our market. I mean, 40% of the hydro we produce in our province is exported to the United States. And we provide 10 to 11% of the power in Minnesota. So it's a great relationship for us and a very important relationship for it. And that relationship has evolved over the decades. We build sustainable hydropower now, and we use a sustainable paradigm. Every hydro project we build is done in partnership with the First Nations in the northern part of the province, in the territory where First Nations live. They are equity partners in the dams. They are first in line for training opportunities and education opportunities. We address all the environmental issues with them before the project is even approved. And we work out a long-term understanding on how we're going to address environmental issues. And we don't just see it as reducing negative impacts. We look at hydro development as an opportunity to make environmental conditions better. And a practical example of that is in the next dam we're building, we're going to be restoring the sturgeon fishery in northern Manitoba, a fishery that had declined over the years. We can build fish ladders. We can have a hatchery. We can work with First Nations people to ensure that the sturgeon fishery comes out of the experience better than it is now. And we're building low-head dams along the, in northern Manitoba. We're not the flooding approach, flood first and compensate for 30 years and fight about it for 30 years and leave a legacy of bitterness is not the way to go. The way to go is partnerships. Everybody agrees up front. Those partnerships yield phenomenal social license and social integration and social understanding, and makes everybody feel a part of the community. They're all citizens. They get a chance to participate in the labor market. That's exactly the kind of outcomes we want. And we want the environmental outcomes as well. So that's why we're doing it, to make sure the environmental benefits are positive for the north and also positive for the south and for climate change issues as well. So we have a sustainable economic development model. When I first went to Wisconsin a few years ago, the legislators said there, why should we take power from Manitoba when we have such a strong interest in our state for renewables that are generated within the state, such as solar power and wind power? And the point we make is that our power acts as base power upon which you can build a platform of renewable power, intermittent renewables. We're long-term, reliable, clean base power, and that allows you to build intermittent renewables on top of that. And Minnesota Power is probably the best example of that. They've developed 400 megawatts of wind in North Dakota, and they're ramping it up to 600, 650. Dave will give you the details. But they're storing that wind power in our dam system. We act as one of the largest batteries in North America. And as we increase our dams and our generation capacity by another 2,200 megawatts over the next 8 or 9 years, a decade, that will increase the size of our battery. So they're able to store that wind power within our system, which makes it a more valuable product and makes it a more viable product and makes it an alternative to other sources of carbon fuels. So that's a very good story. We have complementary sources of power when we can work together to be providers to each other. And I think that point is very fundamental. It's not a question of us competing kilowatt hour or megawatt hour of something south of the border. We can allow more clean power to develop south of the border, our border, by having a relationship on hydropower north of the border. We think they work extremely well together. So that's the second point I really wanted to make. And the third is the whole issues of energy security. If you look at any map, and if that map had the electrical grids on it, it flows mostly north and south through the west coast, British Columbia, down through the west coast, through the Midwest, down into Minnesota and North Dakota and Wisconsin, and of course through the east, through Quebec Hydro, down into the eastern seaboard. We actually, in both countries, probably have less linkages east and west than we have north and south. So we're already an integrated power system in North America. We participate in the MISO system, where we work with each other to ensure the reliability of our power provision to each other, and the border is the minor factor in that. It's the relationships between all the utilities and how they dispatch power and work together on doing that. So it's already a well-integrated system, and more transmission is a key. to ensure that that system can strengthen in the future. So transmission will be a fundamental part of our ability to provide clean power to each other. We build the transmission in our jurisdiction. Minnesota Power will build the transmission in its jurisdiction. That will allow us to extend into Wisconsin. And as I said to the governor of Illinois, once we get to Wisconsin, we'd be happy to talk to you as well in your state, where they're very interested in things like geothermal as well as hydroelectricity as well. So an integrated grid is already part of the reality, and we all know that we need more grid capacity, and I've heard many stories of some of the fast-track grid projects you've been doing down here, transmission projects. This is always a challenge, is to build the grid. Everybody wants to be involved in it. Everybody needs to be accommodated. We have very specific jurisprudence in Canada under our Constitution. We call it Section 35, a requirement to consult all the First Nations in the territories where we build transmission or generation. We have to ensure that if any of their interests are in any way threatened, that we accommodate it in a reasonable fashion and work out a relationship that is respectful of their traditional role on that territory, whether it's hunting or fishing or otherwise. And so we work all of those things out now. That's just the way we have to do business, and it's a good way to do business. It's a way that we're comfortable with because it builds that sort of sense of solidarity and community within our jurisdiction. The other point that's been made to me, and it was one that is very fundamental, the ability for us to provide power in your marketplace at a good price keeps all sources of power more affordable. It acts as a competitive factor on other kinds of power that you have. So it keeps the price lower for the customers, for your citizens, for your consumers, your industries, and that's a benefit to your economy as well. So that's fairly fundamental. Cheap or affordable power is fundamental to economic development. Where we have that in any jurisdiction, it makes a huge difference. And so we like to think we're very much a part of that solution. And I noted the President made some very strong statements on climate change in his State of the Union address. Hydropower, in our view, is a part of the solution to climate change. It's a very important part of that future. When you're not flooding anymore, when you're building low-head dams, when you're doing it in a sustainable way, it's a renewable source of power, it's long-term power, it's clean power, and it provides very useful sort of alternatives to various other forms of power that maybe have a much larger carbon footprint and create more carbon dioxide. So we think it's a big factor in climate change as well. In Manitoba, our hydropower is 98% of our power. We had a couple of coal plants. I'm not saying it was a major victory, but it was significant that we did retire those and replace those with natural gas as backup. And we hold one just on reserve. And so we were able to do that because we had the growth of hydropower within our province. And so that's a very important part of what we do as well. We see it as reliable. Reliability is the quality of power is very important for our modern economy, whether it's manufacturing or information technology. People really want that reliability. They want to know that the lights are going to stay on and that the power is going to be there when you need it. And so there's a lot of gains to be had in that respect as well. And on the question of efficiency, when we first started out working with Manitoba Hydro, when Gary and I first came in '99, Manitoba Hydro was number 10 on energy efficiency out of 10 provinces. We now are number 1, tied with some other jurisdictions, but we've really moved up the food chain on energy efficiency because we just understand that demand management is one of the best things you can do to ensure the long-term conservation of resources and the long-term ability to provide for your economy. So, for example, in our government, we have a green buildings policy. We don't build any new facilities in Manitoba without those buildings being green. And one of the greenest buildings is our new Manitoba Hydro headquarters, which is an award-winning building with 60% reduction off a normal high-rise in the amount of power it consumes. It's got a massive geothermal installation. It has passive solar. It has just a number of features in the design of that building that make it a state-of-the-art building, which we used as a cornerstone for renewing the downtown of Winnipeg. But all of our buildings, we do a lot of LEED buildings in Manitoba now. And I've always make the point that the LEED standards came from the private sector, came from the people in the construction, architectural industry, and that process is a very participatory process in how we design buildings to make sure that the buildings are suitable for the people that want to occupy them, live in them, or work in them, but also consume as little energy as possible for the maximum benefit. So we're doing a lot of that, and that gives you some very exciting architecture as well, and some very exciting outcomes, whether it's schools or hospitals or commercial buildings or residential buildings. Those kinds of design innovations make a big difference in what you're doing in your community. And anybody who's in government, operating costs are a killer in any budget because they're fixed cost. And if you can reduce those fixed costs by investing a little more on the capital side, that reduces your challenges during the inevitable cycle in the economy when you have to keep things going. If you can keep your operating costs down, that makes a big difference from a government perspective. Now, we as a council, the Federation is the rough equivalent of the National Governors Association. When we get together as premiers across the country, we work on projects together. One of the things we've done is we've put a Canadian Energy Strategy Committee together. Alison Redford, the Premier of Alberta, Kathy Dunderdale, the Premier of Labrador and Newfoundland, myself as the Premier of Manitoba, we're co-chairing that committee on a Canadian energy strategy. And we are very interested in working, of course, with our American counterparts on these issues, which is why we're down here making these kinds of contacts and having these kinds of meetings. But we're looking at a Canadian energy strategy through provincial leadership in partnership with the federal government. We think that there's lots more that we can do. We think it's good for the economy. It's a source of innovation. We think it's good for the planet in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. We have a lot of communities in northern Canada where it's very sparsely populated that rely on diesel in very small communities. Diesel, as you know, is not a very clean source of energy. It's a very expensive source of energy. And so one of the things we want to do in that strategy is look at how we can get some of those smaller communities off diesel onto alternative sources of energy, particularly in areas where it may not be cost effective to hook them up to the larger grid. In Manitoba, we only have 4 of those small communities left, and we're moving towards alternatives to diesel, which is extremely expensive. And if you can get off that, the paybacks, even with the most expensive paybacks, we think the you sort of get your return at least 11 years out. And 11 years may sound a long time to those that like a 7-year turnaround, but 11 years to me is quite reasonable when you get all the benefits that flow after that indefinitely. So there's just so much that we can do by understanding that we are each other's best friends when it comes to an energy strategy, and that what we do is entirely complementary to what you want to achieve. It provides you with good base power. It provides you with a good, reliable customer, a provider of that power. We also bring your power back into our jurisdiction when we need it through these integrated grids, so it works to our mutual benefit on both sides of the border, and we think there's more we can do together. And with those brief comments, I'll sit down and then we'll take questions and have a good discussion about it. And thank you for your attendance here today. Thanks very much.
So we have a very brief time for questions for Premier Selinger and Ambassador Duerr. We have microphones in the back. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Up here.
Yeah, I'm Ethan Goffman from Sustainability Science Practice and Policy. I wanted to I'll ask the controversial one, tar sands. How do you see that both with the U.S. and Canada as affecting the greenhouse gas emissions? Is that part of a complementary energy strategy, or is that working against hitting those emissions limits for both countries?
You want me to answer that? I think I've had a few of those questions before. Well, I think that in terms of per capita demand in the United States and Canada, by agreeing to energy efficiency standards that we both have with cars, and light vehicles, trucks, we are reducing the demand in North America, in Canada and the United States. I think that having said that, the oil sands does have GHGs. They're less today per barrel than they were 15 years ago. The proposed pipeline that's controversial here, and it is controversial with some people, not with the general public, but with some people are opposed to it, is intended to displace Venezuelan oil and displace and make the United States less reliable on Middle Eastern oil. Pardon?
Reliant, not reliable.
Reliant, I'm sorry. The greenhouse gases from Venezuelan oil, according to Daniel Yergin, are higher than the Canadian oil sands oil, just based on his latest report. I'd also suggest that the pipeline includes Bakken oil from North Dakota and Montana, and that oil right now has gone 2 years ago, and the Premier met with the senator from North Dakota. That oil was 10% of it was transported on trucks and trains. It's now up to 60% on trucks and trains. And that means that, and all research on pipelines for energy efficiency and greenhouse gases indicate that there's lower GHGs from a pipeline than trucks and trains. So to me, it's not an either or. I actually do believe the president, when he promised to go to energy independence from the Middle East and Venezuela in 2008 with Canada and United States, Canada, United States, and Mexico, he is able to achieve that partly with oil from Canada. But he has also promised to implement the 17% reduction in greenhouse gases, partly through less per capita demand on oil in both our countries with the aligned energy efficiency standards. And I think he will be able to, he and the United States together will be able to achieve that 17% reduction.
Bridget in the back.
Good afternoon. Bridget Mathieson, the Washington Office of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Premier, I just came from a meeting with some of my U.S. manufacturing colleagues here in the United States, and I promised them I would ask you this question. So you're in D.C., highly volatile times, as I'm sure you've been briefed upon. The business recovery here in the U.S. and probably in Canada is a bit fragile right now. We're looking at some bad news at the end of the week. Hydroelectricity from Manitoba or hydroelectricity from the United States, that's usually good news for manufacturing. We'd like to have some good news and a bit more stability. How much of, for example, Manitoba's hydroelectricity is going to manufacturing in either Canada and the United States? Do you know that versus consumer homes?
I don't have a precise number for you on that. I'm looking at my hydro guys. They don't either, but I can tell you this. It's often thought that Western economy is a commodity-driven economy. And there are very significant commodities in the West, like potash, like oil, like gas. But in Manitoba, 14% of our economy is manufacturing. And about a third of that manufacturing economy is value-added food products. Agriculture, when you think of Manitoba, you think of, it's an agriculture, it's only 3%. But we do a lot of good value-added food products in the manufacturing sector. And of course, they consume electricity as part of that. But our hydro has worked very closely with the manufacturing sector to shrink their footprint of what they consume to make it as efficient as possible. This is one of the things that we have been doing for well over 15 years now, to work with all the manufacturers and all the major industries to reduce their demand and to be as efficient as possible, because it helps their bottom line. I mean, it's just a good business case, more over and above anything else, but it also reduces the demand for electricity and reduces the future growth of capital costs and allows us to export more products. So it's a very important. We've had what we call an advanced manufacturing initiative with industry and government for the last several years, and we've seen our productivity improve quite dramatically. It's not very well known across the country, but our province had been one of the biggest gainers on productivity improvements in the workforce in our province. And in large measure, it's because of some of the partnerships we've had between manufacturers, educational institutions, and energy providers like Manitoba Hydro.
We have time for one more question before we have to get on to the rest of the program. In the back there.
Hi, Jeff Hopkins from Rio Tinto. I appreciate the discussion on hydro and the ambassador's comment about treatment of or recognition of hydropower in the U.S. I was under the impression that California did recognize BC Hydro imports as zero emitting. Now they may not. I don't know about the renewable classification, and it might be useful just to say a word about one versus the other, being labeled as renewable versus being labeled as low carbon. What's more desirable, and what are the objectives?
Well, I've met with Governor Brown, and we've had this discussion on the definition. Where it becomes now, California has moved into a carbon trading regime in that state. But if at some point they go to a certain definition or a portfolio that requires a certain percentage of electrical generation to be renewable, it's useful for BC Hydro to be considered a renewable energy. So you have some utilities in the United States, some states in the United States, and I think XL has one standard for renewable electrical production to Minnesota, and I may be dated, so I better be careful. But it is useful for us to be considered on the Hill as renewable, in energy bills as renewable, along with solar, wind, and geothermal, as opposed to not be considered that. Because when later on, when states or utilities go into a portfolio, if they don't go into a carbon trading regime, or if they do both, it's better to be defined as renewable.
Yeah.
So that's where I would see the advantage of it. In Hydro-Quebec did that with the governor and state of Vermont. And we've used that model everywhere in the United States is where we would like to go. And that was used by the governor of Vermont with the president at the governor's meeting with them a couple of years ago, and it has been used by the prime minister to the president at a North American Leaders Summit.
And I would just like to say, to classify it as renewable, we obviously that would give it a premium recognition. But as I made the point earlier, it really allows you to build other renewables on top of that, the intermittent renewables on top of that, and makes them more valuable and more viable in the marketplace. So it's a win-win in that regard.
Well, thank you very much. Please help me thank Ambassador Dewar and Premier Selinger, and we'll set the new panel up.
David.